Right. How's everybody doing? We're streaming this on both the True DFS YouTube, the PayDirt YouTube, and the PayDirt Twitter X account and stuff. I'm joined by James McCool, obviously of PayDirt. And if you don't know who I am, I'm Brandon Cruz. I want to be talking about plate racing specifically in this. Now, I've had a lot of questions and stuff since it was announced that PayDirt and True DFS had merged at the beginning of February and stuff. And there is a code in the description of the videos if you guys want 50% off your first month with PayDirt. But I had questions about, hey, Cruz, can you make a intro video, a how-to video for NASCAR, and so on and so forth. The fact that I had been, doing this content for, almost, 8, 9 years at this point, and seeing how the industry had kind of switched from, obviously building stuff for cash games and so on and so forth. I really didn't want to do just a standard, this is a NASCAR 101 introduction to NASCAR video. I'd rather focus more on the week to week differences and nuances of each individual slate and stuff. And I wanted to use or have James on for these videos because not only am I introducing this world and this sport to James, it's also providing him more of a, background or support for the ideas that I've talked to him in terms of what I want in the projections and the PayDirt tools and so on and so forth. And so today we're going to be discussing the races this weekend at Daytona, not the duels on Thursday, and we'll talk about those, in the live show on Thursday, but specifically the state of DFS for the Friday, Saturday, and Sunday races and stuff. So, James, if you have any questions or anything you want to mention or talk about, we can do that. But I'm just happy to be here and finally talking about this stuff because these are my favorite races.
There we go. Yeah, I was muted. So, yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited to have some really consistent and high-level NASCAR content and models and everything like that. I've been talking about wanting to have NASCAR on the site for, I don't know, 3 years, 2.5 years, 3 years. But I have never just gone about putting things together because frankly, I didn't know enough about the sport. I like F1, I like cars, I like racing, but I've just never gotten into NASCAR. The one time that I played NASCAR DFS, this was maybe 7 years ago. All right. The one time I got a penalty for speeding and I said, that's fucking stupid. Just stop playing. But that was back in my daily roto days. And, things have come a long way. And I understand a lot more about NASCAR as a sport, as a concept, and the way to model it now. So we're going to be working together, Brandon and I, to make sure that the models are tuned and honed towards the things that he knows win. Right. We're not going to be building out projection models that are kind of like baseline, same thing as the industry stuff. We're going to be happy to move away from that and build things in a way that actually helps subscribers win. So I think with his expertise and with my ability to just build whatever, we're going to be able to build some really cool stuff. So really, really excited to kick this off.
Yeah, especially that I'd been hand building stuff, this entire time, and I've had no reason to stop doing that because I found success, and the people who've used my stuff have found success, and I'm just excited to be with a team that can just elevate what I'm already doing on my hand building side for projections, and then be able to show people upside and pivots and stuff for racers and stuff. And I do see a lot of comments, and I'm glad that Andy thinks this is fantastic. I'm glad that a lot of people are excited for this merger. For those of you that know me, I do have a playlist that I've had up on my YouTube channel for years at this point. I went ahead and shared that back to the PayDirt Discord, and obviously the True DFS people have seen it, or hopefully they've seen it over the years. I'm kind of going to be touching on the stuff in that specific playlist. That playlist is almost 12-13 hours long of specifically just this style of racing, but I wanted to hit the cliff notes and kind of simplify this versus just the random introduction stuff. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. We're going to be bouncing back between a good old paint.net file and different spreadsheets that I have, and I'm going to be explaining why I yet again how I'm using the PayDirt tools to simplify my personal process, since especially for these races I don't use contest sims, I don't use any of that stuff when I'm building my 50, 60, 80 lines for the main GPP, typically I had been, somewhat hand building that or kind of going a back end way through Saber Sim to just get what I wanted versus using whatever the default was. And so, anyway, I'll be explaining why I do certain things and whatnot. When we look at the races that are at super speedways, which are categorized as the tracks that are Daytona and Talladega, the big tracks that, when you think of NASCAR, you think of, Talladega Nights, you think of these gigantic packs of cars, and so on and so forth. So these are those kind of generic tracks that you would visualize, especially if you aren't, a traditional NASCAR fan, which yet again is why I think James being a part of the shows are so good, because James, you don't know anything about NASCAR, which is, I haven't known that world in like 15 years. I don't know what people don't normally know.
Right.
So when we're looking at the races for this weekend, these races typically break down in one of two directions, and these directions, if you're visualizing like a fork in the road or like a pathway of how to build lineups, it typically breaks down into these situations here. And so you have scenario one of there is no crash, or actually we're going to go with scenario one is there's no crash. Okay, it doesn't necessarily matter if we're talking the Truck Series, Xfinity Series, Cup Series, whatever. Scenario one is that we don't crash a bunch of cars. We don't tear up equipment, whatever the case may be. This first scenario, which is how ideally projections should be based off of, because no crash means that we're looking at a boring race. We're looking at, good drivers finishing where they should. And so on and so forth. So, when you're building projections or looking at a race like this, it's usually fairly easy to project for or to build projections off of. Now, what defines good drivers, what defines, so on, that obviously in the details, race to race, year to year, but that's built into my projections. But typically, if you have experience at these racetracks, if you're with a good team, by default, you should be finishing up front. Okay. This is scenario one, which does happen. Okay. The other scenario that we run into are crashes, which, like, do we have crashes in these races? Now, what does that necessarily mean? If you think of NASCAR and their gigantic crashes, you've either seen GIFs or videos of, these gigantic 15, 20 car pileups or whatever. Okay. There is a lot of statistics and a lot of, race theory of what goes into those situations that cause those crashes. Okay. So if we look into the crash situation, we're typically looking at, does this crash, or rather, is this race a wreck fest, which just means literally everybody and their mother are being involved in crashes? Or do we have, one big crash? And is that potentially early in a race? Is that potentially late in a race? Where does that crash happen changes everything from a DFS perspective. Who's involved in that crash changes everything from a DFS perspective and a build perspective and stuff like that. Now, over the years, James, the way that NASCAR runs these events, especially from COVID, is that they've gone ahead and limited, if not flat out removed, practice for a majority of these races. And so when you think of, up and coming drivers, when you think of, 18-year-olds, 20-year-olds and stuff being thrown into these fast machines, running 190 miles an hour, they aren't being able to gain the experience that drivers 10, 20 years ago had at their age or whenever they were in these races and stuff. So we've seen an uptick in crashes and volatility for DFS and stuff. And so going back to that kind of the scenarios, is there no crashes or are there no crashes? Do we have crashes? We're leaning towards heavily towards the races that there are crashes involved in these events. Okay. From a projection standpoint, when we lean heavily into the volatility of these races and stuff, this is where our advantages and stuff come from building projections, stuff like that. I want to go ahead and then show why I'm talking about, and I have to thank my good friend ACS, who is a phenomenal DFS player. Actually, I already have this one open. Who is went ahead and let me use some of the spreadsheets that he's collected data for over the years, not only for this video but in the past and stuff. And he's categorized the optimal lineups, the scoring for these tracks from a DFS perspective and stuff. And so what we're looking at here is, which is important to this page. Let's zoom in just a little bit so people can kind of see here. When we look at this table here, which is the end all be all for my approach, my projections, and this is for the Cup Series at this specific track that we're at this Sunday. We are looking at the starting position of the top 12 DraftKings points scorers. And so what we're seeing here is, obviously, this row is the highest DraftKings scorer, second highest, third highest, fourth highest, so on and so forth. These rows here, these columns represent what starting position those drivers had in these events. So you're going to notice that we see a lot of green in these races, or a lot of green positions, and that is people who are starting in the back of the field. Okay, when we look at races that a vast majority of people are either inexperienced on, or they don't have, they just don't have experience, we're seeing 65, 70, 75% of any given race field be involved in a crash in some form or fashion. From a DFS perspective, that adds a ton of risk that you don't even need to take from people who are starting in the top half of the field, starting closer up to the field. And this is backed up by, when we're looking at your scores for these races, we're seeing, your highest score last year in the 500 started 40th. This guy started 38th. This guy started 36th, 18th, 16th, 25th, 11th, 5th. This guy started 5th, and he was only the 8th highest scoring driver. When we're looking at these, and this is just the, the top 12 DK points. This might not even necessarily be the optimal. When we're looking at where the DraftKings points are following, the starting positions and stuff, this leans to a lot of randomness. This leads to a lot of building lineups that you wouldn't normally build on any given DFS week. Usually you're very close to using all of your salary. When we look at optimal lineups for this race last year, the winning lineup in the big, 500,000 or whatever it is to first used 45,300. The optimal lineup used 43,700. You continue to go through. Let me move this here. You continue to go through and look back at these races, and you're seeing this lineup used 37,000. This lineup used 38,000. And we keep going through, and we're seeing that a lot of these lineups are leaving a ton of salary on the table. Now, why is that? We're seeing if every driver has a possibility of being involved in a wreck 70, 75% of the time, then the experience level doesn't matter. Then whether you're a low salary guy or a high salary guy, that really isn't coming into play at these racetracks. Everybody has, that 75% chance of being involved in a yellow. When I was talking about, I may have deleted it. When I was talking about here of where does that crash happen? Does it happen early in the race? Does it happen late in the race? Where does it happen in the field? We're typically seeing that the drivers who would finish well if the race went green, like there's no crashes, where everybody should be running, in the races where we're having crashes, it's those drivers who are running up front, who have good equipment, who have the skill level to be up front. Those are exactly the drivers being involved in the wrecks. So when we're looking backwards at, let me see if I can bring these drivers up here. When we're looking at drivers who, you're wanting to play, we're just playing drivers who are starting in the back of the field, regardless of who they are, regardless of what teams they are, because they just have a higher survival chance. They have just a higher chance of actually scoring well. You look at where these totals for some of these races are, and you look at where the bottom half of these drivers are scoring, we're seeing a lot of people, in the negatives. And if you're not scoring, probably over 30 points, you're just not going to be contending for these races. where we're seeing where are we at? Where's this one? We're seeing a huge amount of expensive guys and good drivers scoring in the negatives because they're being wrecked out of these races and stuff. And so when I build my lineups, and yet again, we're going to talk about how I'm using James's stuff to not only expand or make my life easier. This is a lot of the stuff that I've been able to take advantage of and build for and stuff. And I know there's a lot of information I'm throwing at just for this specific race, but is any of this making sense to you? Am I throwing too much at you at one time, or how are you feeling about just what I'm saying here regarding the 3 races this weekend? And I believe you are muted, if I'm not mistaken.
Son of a bitch. It's because I keep typing. Anyway, yeah. I mean, I'm gonna have to drop my minimum salary in the portfolio manager. That's for sure. Just like it makes sense that in races where there are crashes, and because we know how much value there is in terms of moving up in positions. I mean, even a guy who moves up 15, 20 spots and doesn't finish the race in first, he's still going to way outscore somebody who crashed. And if those top guys crash, then they're just completely screwed. So that makes sense. It's a much different way to think about DFS. I think that a lot of people probably look at NASCAR and think of it more like PGA, like a mix of PGA and NBA. But it seems like it's like if you were playing PGA and there was somebody out on the field with a paintball gun, and every 6 holes or whatever, they would go out there and they would just like take some pot shots at guys. So that's what it seems like to me. It seems like it's fun. It seems like a fun sport.
Yes. And or if I'm thinking of analogies that now we're coming off of a Super Bowl that was pretty lackluster, but it's my best analogy that I've used over the years when I'm trying to get people in the mentality of what it takes to perform well at these races. It it's almost equivalent to like if you had an NFL team, but you had practice squad guys, doing well in a real game. If a whole you didn't have a 52-man roster on any given Sunday, you had the 52-man roster plus the practice guys, and they're involved in the game and they're doing significantly better than your starting wide receivers or whatever. I think that's a good analogy. Or you could look at it as Christian McCaffrey has the exact same chance of actually scoring just 10 yards as a practice squad guy. That's I think the practice squad analogies are probably the better ones to use here. I do see a comment I believe it's from yeah. I'm terrible with names. I've seen your name before. I don't know how to pronounce it. I never ever want to completely mess it up. When we're looking at NASCAR this year, so they changed their championship format this year, James, which they're just reverting back to what it was during the 2000s. The changes so in the past or in these last 6 years, NASCAR would determine who would run for a championship during the regular season by if you just won a race. It didn't matter how you really performed during the regular season. It just, if you were able to win one single race, you would compete for the championship late in the year. That's not the case anymore.
Okay.
But for this specific race, especially because, and especially in the lower series, because we have, as I said, inexperienced people or just guys who are just there to show up for wins, like all the truck guys in the field on Friday. I don't really see a change in that because let me bring this up on my screen really fast. There's a data point that I had shown you off stream, about 2 weeks ago when I first started talking to you about this stuff. And it's actually using data just straight from the 2000s, which I really, really like. Let me bring it up here. And so when we look back at where, the fields ran specifically at Daytona during the 2000s, where this, point system was there. When we're looking at the screen here, this is data that I used to back in tests specifically for a track that we had. The yellow, each individual race is labeled by, a column here, and then every yellow is what would be considered. We didn't have fast laps, or NASCAR didn't keep fast lap scoring, but I do have obviously starting position, finishing position, and then laps led. These are the best expectations of what optimals would look like in that time frame. So if I'm looking back at just to answer this specific question, if you think that the winning you're in being removed is going to make things either less or more volatile, whatever, it doesn't seem to have an impact. And in fact, we're still leaning towards a majority of the highest scores and optimal lineups coming from the back half of the field, especially when you look at the early Daytona races, James. So NASCAR, as stated from last week, you had that, exhibition race that was basically ran in sleet that took like 4 hours to compete. Um, NASCAR does a lot of things that aren't like normally on a week to week basis. This week, the starting grid for the race on Sunday is determined by 2 races on Thursday. And where you finish in those races determine where you start on Thursday. And so when we're looking back at the Daytona 500s for these races, I have 108, 107. That's the Daytona 500 in 07. The fall race in 2007 is dictated by the 2 year. Anyway, I have those races that are being gridded by the duels or the qualifying race on Thursday. And if you look, when we look at the back half of the field on races that are started by how people perform in the duels, you typically have teams, good teams rather, that might mess up in the dual race or might be involved in a crash or have to go to a backup car or whatever. And you see good teams that should be competing for the wins having to start at the back of this grid because they ran into issues on Thursday and stuff like that. And so, yet again, just a lot of data backing up that you specifically want to focus on guys in the back. Now, what does that look like? What does that mean from a DFS perspective? Now, I don't, or yet again, this is my friend Aaron's stuff that he pulls. So this isn't exactly every single race. This is just ones that he's determined that were important. But he has the CSV files of the big slates of these races that he found somewhat significant or whatever. And I don't exactly remember what he has in here. So he has the percent drafted. This one I was hoping he still had. He had the percent drafted. He had obviously the DraftKings ranking at the end of it. Where these guys were at. And if you notice, yet again, you have guys who are going to be like heavy on ownership that really end up performing quite badly. Obviously, this one guy who started 34th at 44% ownership was optimal, but everybody else were direct pivots off of the chalk. When if we were to rank this or look at it from a starting position, and then yet again, I'll have my projections back up whether they're a good driver or a bad driver, and you're going to see that there's really no reason for somebody starting 38th to be at 21% ownership, and just a bigger known guy starting 6 positions ahead or even 3 positions ahead, and they have 2 times the ownership or 12% more ownership and stuff. And so when we're building lineups, and a lot of people worry about duplications, and this is the Millie contest from 2014, you're going to notice that there's really not, for a field that, how many people are in this? Said 94,000 lineups, which shout out to the people who just forgot to enter lineups. We're really not seeing that much duplication once wrecks happen, once volatility creeps up. Like, we're really not seeing that much duplication, just because you can take advantage of where ownership is and stuff. Same thing with just different Xfinity races. Hey, here's one where I'm finishing 5th or whatever, by playing just random guys. And you're seeing that when the wrecks happen and when volatility happens, you just don't run into duplications at all. And yet again, this is something that I go very deep on in terms of that playlist that I was mentioning. where if there's a specific race or specific stuff you want to, look at, you can either watch that or you can DM me and I'll talk you through more stuff. But I'm just trying to nail, the key notes, the key points of what makes this style of race and this approach so at least enjoyable for me, and really how you can take advantage of not using medium projections or not using bigger site stuff specifically for these races.
Yeah, one of my questions was going to be around ownership. Ownership and duplications, because when I build out the portfolio manager, one of the things that I have to do is I have to develop a baseline global ownership value that is used for each sport, right? So for certain sports, it's much higher, right? NBA, it's like 250%. For say PGA, it's much lower. It's only at like 110% or something like that. So that baseline ownership global for each sport is used to dictate duplication logic, right? But it's good to hear that duplications are not necessarily a big problem on winning lineups. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not duplicates, right? I mean, there's probably going to be like pretty heavy duplications on bad lineups, but on the winning lineups, it sounds like you can probably build things out in a way that in mitigating your duplications, you are also adding EV just because you're playing correctly.
Yes.
Cool. Okay. Awesome.
I'm hoping that he has more, because I stopped tracking this stuff like years ago once I was comfortable with where I was at. I'm trying to see if he has any other recent ones. See what happened here. This one is empty, or not what I'm looking for. But let's see. Let's move on. I'm missing one. I closed out of it earlier. Let me see. All right, I lost that sheet. I'm not be able to find it right now. Anyway, going back to building lineups and stuff. When we specifically look at ownership of where guys are coming in at, which actually wouldn't be on this one. Let's bring this one back up, the one I just had. I don't want to mess one of his sheets up. Sorry, give me a moment here. Let me find the one that I just had here. Sorry, everybody. I'm trying to find a sheet that I just X'd out of on complete accident on the background. And as you can tell, I have tons of sheets that have very similar names. Okay, so here we're back to the one we were looking at. So this one is ranked by starting position. Okay, and so this is a great example of how, now this is a 2023 race, but the ownership that is surrounding people in the back here are dictated by, are they with a good team, or do they have good not even experience, good finishes at these tracks? Okay. Typically I look at how drivers are running during a specific race, where they are positioning themselves in a race, because unlike a sport like NBA, if Lucas scores 42 points, has 11 rebounds, whatever, he doesn't lose those points. It's because he's good, right? If he fouls out in the fourth quarter, he doesn't drop to 0 points. Okay, so typically ownership and projections typically follow a results-based, I guess what I would argue is an algorithm, where they just pool, or not even pool. Like you would look at where driver A is finished at this specific track in the past, and then assign him a projection based on that. Now, whether that's because he was in a was he lucky towards the end of a race, did he just finish there, whatever, they're just looking at the final where he's finishing. And so when we look at ownership on these races, Kligerman in this race carrying 63% ownership. Jeremy Clement's 47% ownership. There was data at this point in time that was showing that these guys were most likely going to perform well. Yet again, you combine that with the fact that if you're in a race in this day and age, you have 70-75% chance of being involved in a crash at any given point. There should be no reason ownership should be that high on any one individual driver and be so much lower on somebody who is just directly beside them who just might not have the history. And Aaron has done a good job here at actually labeling who was in the contest winning lineup, who was off but not in a winning lineup, and you can see where these guys scored. And how do you take advantage of that as a DFS player, or what do I do in terms of if I'm building lineups and stuff? And so I know for a fact I probably would have projected this driver to score very well, and I can use that to then look at where ownership is going to be at. I think for these races, it's usually fairly easy to project where ownership is going to go. If you look at the top of the starting grid, yet again, if you're using a medium projection source or whatever, Austin Hill, who in this series had been, winning a lot of these races and starting up front in the first position, whether it be contest sims, whether it be whatever things that players are using to build, this guy's starting on pole with 26, percent ownership, where there's a high likelihood, which we see here, of drivers starting up front, not scoring well. And not even not scoring well, like being some of the worst scorers on the slate and stuff. We then see, and yet again, just because I know these drivers, we see high ownership on Riley Herbst, on Sam Mayer, on Cole Custer, on Barry, on Jones, because these drivers are in quote unquote good teams, and they're going to be on the higher end of the salary cap, in each slate. And then we look at what optimals are looking at it, and as I started, or when I was going through the data, we see 6,000, 8,000, potentially $10,000 being left on the table, just because typically you don't need to pay up for the good teams and drivers and whatnot. Anyway, getting to the PayDirt side of this and what I've been working with James and how I'm planning on using this data, and why I'm excited to show this to people or have it up here. I mentioned my reasoning behind Brandon, if you're winning contests or you're performing so well as a DFS player, like why give that away? Are you giving up an edge or anything like that? Because I play so much, the rule of averages tends to be in my favor over the course of a year, to where I can show enough of my stuff, and I'm still probably going to bank enough tournaments or perform well enough to where it's not really a big hindrance to me. And then on top of the variance that, even I'm going to get burned, even if I project things the way I want to. NASCAR is the hardest sport. Anybody can blow a tire. Anybody can lose an engine at any given point. And so there's enough of those points to say, hey, I'm okay, showing my stuff. And then on top of, being paid to promote my stuff and everything. The thing that I've been working with James is really kind of focusing on these races specifically is to limit the ceiling performances of good drivers and to bring up the floor performances of the quote unquote bad drivers. Okay. Which, James, if you want to talk a little bit more about that, since this is your stuff that you're kind of working with me to integrate my approach on. But what I've seen so far from, back in testing, really not from last week, is a exhibition race with 23 cars, but when I've looked at this in an actual real slate type of look, I've been extremely happy with the outputs of what's being shown to the PayDirt users and stuff.
Mm-hmm. So if you want to run over to PayDirt really quick, we can take a look, because I do have the things that I built out live.
Let me make sure
yesterday.
I'm signed in.
So what we're attempting to do here is, for those of you who don't know me, I specialize in truncated distribution statistics. And so what I'll end up doing is I look at a sport and I do a lot of study on how a player or a racer or a golfer or whatever, how somebody in that sport performs within a distribution. right? There's a whole bunch of distributions. There's normal distributions, which is the one that most people know, which is the bell curve. There's bimodal distributions, which is kind of like two bell curves next to each other. There are truncated distributions, which is where you have kind of like a bell curve, but then one side is kind of like stumped a little bit, right? And so that's one of the main things that I do is I look at the way that players perform, and I create truncated distributions around them based on what we know gives them ceilings or floors, right? So when we were looking at NASCAR, one of the things that we wanted to do was say, okay, if we were just project this off of medians and do a normal distribution, that's basically what you see here on the screen in front of you. Okay. So this is ran with the projections around a distribution between the 33rd percentile and the 66th percentile. So that's one standard deviation. Not exactly, because we're not using historicals here, but eyeballing it, that's one standard deviation away from the mean. And so what you see is a very linear distribution, right? The dudes who have a high median also have a high top finish percentage, also have a top 3, top 5, top 10, top 15, top 20 percentage, all that kind of stuff, right? As you go down farther, right, you're going to see the top 25 and the top 30, they stop being 100%, and then they end up dropping down as well because the medians are low, right? And it's just around that median. But one of the things that we want to be able to do is say, okay, we know that these aren't just normal distributions. We know that there's a lot of variance involved in these things. So the way that I built out this model for Brandon to utilize is he now has control over the floor and ceiling variables that are applied against the truncated distributions. And so if we look at a player like Kyle Larson and say, okay, yeah, based on his starting position, laps led, fastest laps, all that kind of stuff, his median is good. It's 75.65. But we know that his ceiling is kind of shot, right? And that his floor is nothing. So in that case, maybe instead of 3366, like a single standard deviation on our distribution, maybe in that case, we instead do like a 0 to 40, right? Like maybe we want that to be where his ceiling is only like 80 and his floor is 0. And if we do that, then what we end up seeing is now his top finish rate drops way down. It's not completely in line with what his median is. So we can actually see like a very extreme example of this, Brandon, if you go up and if you change the slate to secondary. So this is built with a distribution between 0 and 100, meaning that the distributions are basically flat between 3 standard deviations around the drivers. And now what we see is that these guys have a completely random distribution around them, right? Like top 3, top 5, all this different kind of stuff is just completely random, no matter what the starting grid is, no matter the price, no matter the projection, all that kind of stuff. So this can show that like we have really, really, really good control over how these drivers are going to project out in the range of outcomes. Whereas it's not just about the medians, right? Like the medians are important because they dictate where the truncated distribution starts. But how we affect the floor and the ceiling is where we're really going to make our money this year. And it's going to make it so that, you know, when we run the portfolio manager and when we run hand builds and when we run the optimals and stuff like that, we can really have good fine-grained control over like, okay, if this is a race where we want back of the field guys who are like later on in the grid, we can not only, you know, synthetically remove them with different variable controls, but we can also look at it and say, you know, if we were to sort this by top 10 rate or top 15 rate or whatever, like we would be able to see, oh, you know, there's all these guys in the back of the field that are actually up here, and the guys in the top of the field at the top grid are down at the bottom. So we're going to be able to do a lot of really cool things with the distributions around here using those floor and ceiling variables.
And even in races that, you know, like for now, what we're looking at here is stuff based on, you know, the Clash's data points.
Mm-hmm.
But like even a race that chaotic, I'm very happy with the outputs of where the drivers are where the drivers are showing up based on just their potential percentage to finish in certain positions, which yet again if ownership is the name of the game for NASCAR, which I've tried my best to just take advantage of that over the years, I think using this and just being able to see this all in one place, not only just here, but then you can go to Hand Builder and find your pivots and even look at what is being shown as my optimals and stuff. For me, this is like my whole process just simplified into, all I do is I finish my hand built projections, and then everything I would use normally is already on the screen. That usually would take me an additional, 10 to 15 minutes of messing around, or just in my head trying to figure out where I think everybody kind of lies on their outcomes and stuff.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really, really good for your process. I think that, I mean, not only for your process, you have your process, right? This is just going to like help to flesh things out and help you see things a little bit more clearly. But I think that it's going to help a lot of people be able to see what your process actually means, right? Like it's not going to be like roto grinders where we're just looking at median projections and like optimal rates. We're going to flesh this out in a way that makes it so that people can see what you mean when you say you're going to build this way. And the ownership stuff is going to also be massive on this, because it's going to allow us to then go into the portfolio manager and load things up and say, oh, okay, so this lineup that has, these guys in the top grids, this lineup is going to have 170% ownership or something. But then this lineup that has none of the top 10 guys is going to have like 110. It's like, that's just an easy choice, right? Like you just wipe your hands clean of that one and you just play it in single entry or whatever. So I think the tools are going to be a really, really good representation of how you want to play.
Yeah. And, people can just have access to it,
Right.
like that, like I can still build the way I want to build, but people can still just use exactly what I'm using to either potentially build the same way, or maybe even if they're here and they still want to go a different direction, they're at least still aware of just where I'm at and where I'm looking at stuff. And I like it that at least from this point forward, there's really not like, at least, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, once all this data is up, your optimals don't change because you're not running like contest sims. Like the optimals and stuff are just there based on the data presented, correct?
Yeah, correct. They're just so the way that I manage the optimals is I actually hold them in a database, and I hold like as many optimals as I basically feasibly can. I think for NASCAR, it's probably going to be somewhere in like the 180,000 range or something like that. But basically just hold the optimals. And then anytime that I rerun things, it'll rerun the optimals, but we don't have to rerun them all that often. So after that, it's just parsing down and downloading from the database.
Yeah. One thing that made my process really hard with the contest sims and really just sims in general is that even if I had the same input data, if I ran stuff in R or whatever tools I was working with, whether somebody built them for me or whatever, I would still kind of always get different stuff every time I reran. Whereas with NASCAR, like we're not waiting on a starting lineup in terms of who's in and out. We already have the data well in advance, or at least following qualifying. Like I don't need to rerun stuff up to the last minute. Once I have my stuff in here, like that's it. My hands are done. I'm just going through to find what lineups I'm going to use at that point, which is the reason why I'm very happy with how all this stuff is looking for, or what it's looking at.
Yeah, it should be super, super streamlined for you now.
Yeah. And then the last thing, yet again, this is still pulling clash data and stuff, but in these races this weekend, we have, we're gonna have 40 cars, or at least 36 in all of them, but we're gonna have 41 cars on Sunday, 38 on Saturday, and I believe potentially 38 or 39 on Friday with the truck OEM provisional. Anyway, when you have all 40 guys here, yet again, when we're looking at playing guys and their volatility and everything, the thing that's going to be really helpful that I would already do in the past is, where are these guys? Or are they finishing in the top half of the field? What is their percentage of finishing in the top 15? If you're pretty much guaranteed to finish top 30 because you're starting 32nd, you should, by definition, like look way more appealing than people who aren't, guaranteed to finish there. Like, duh, obviously. But I, I just really, really like how all this stuff is being presented. And I'm looking forward to doing live shows with it. I've really moved away from doing a week by week or a race by race preview, just because it's kind of the same old thing each week. We have 96 slates. It's like, okay, well, data says you want to play the fastest guy in practice or the guy who qualifies well. Like, that's the preview for each week. Whereas I really like to look at each slate by slate,
Mm-hmm.
Based on where the salaries are, based on post qualifying, based on where the field is going, and stuff on that. So that's why I've moved more towards just the day of live shows and talking people through what I'm doing.
Yeah. And we are going to get also Tribe and Jason on. Whereas that's going to be more of like them breaking down the slate after we have talked to them about how this thing kind of breaks out, right? Like they'll watch this video and it'll click for them. But then Jason and I are going to do some things around the portfolio manager as well. So, you and the other two DFS guys are going to get to know the portfolio manager intimately as well. But Jason and I already have a really, really good grasp of it and have a really good understanding of how to get it to do the things we want. So we're going to take the first couple swings at that so that we can get everybody like on board with it and show how to use the different diversity settings and how to use the different functions with NASCAR and like how to set things up in a way that gives you lineups that are worth playing and all that kind of stuff, right? So I think that our content schedule, on top of you doing all of like the live shows with tools, is also going to include a lot of me and Tribe and Jason. Now that NFL is over, until we got MLB, we ain't got shit to do. So we're just going to hit NASCAR, MMA, and PGA as hard as we can.
Yeah, and I think it'd be, as stated in this video, is, obviously an introduction or an introduction to the tools on here, on top of talking about, the approach for this weekend and stuff. But I think it's going to be really good to not only, like, obviously my shows are going to be here, and then, like you guys kind of doing that stuff separate. That's just more eyes on a slate. That's more eyes on the content. That's more exposure towards how not only I'm approaching, but how you guys are using the tools and stuff like that. And I think having all that as the, in front of the paywall, whereas like for those watching or seeing this on the screen, I will pretty much never show any of this on the stream. I'm just going to be talking about the slate, but any data or stuff that you want to see, obviously that's going to be behind the paywall. My live shows and stuff is like, the preview to get you guys in and stuff like that. So, maybe you're watching, a video of mine as I'm doing a live show like in March, and you're like, man, I'd love to see, all the data that Brandon's made for an individual driver. That's why we're trying to get you guys to come behind the paywall so you can see all this stuff and you can see how James and everybody uses it.
It's gonna be awesome. I'm excited. It's gonna be great.
Yeah, I don't really have anything else to say regarding this, just because everybody, and specifically for the people who have watched me for years, everybody knows that I play very heavy, stack from the back type of lineups, and I'm mainly focusing on how to make sure I don't have duplications and stuff. That type of approach is made drastically easier with these tools and stuff. It's saving me a massive amount of time.
Another really cool thing that you're going to be able to do with the tools is use the pivot finder. The pivot finder is going to be a really, really easy way to find, like, if you were to want to look at reducing duplicates or like anything like that, and you just want to say, I know that Kyle Larson is going to be the highest owned driver. Show me duplicates of him. If you go up really quick and switch this back into simple instead of advanced, and you click on that action that's similar over there. So there are no drivers that are similar to Kyle Larson. But if you move that minimum similarity down a little bit, then you can see what drivers are similar to him based on a similarity score. So say that, there's a 60% owned driver, right? We're projecting somewhere 50% owned. Being able to just go and look and click on them and say, oh, there's 3 other guys that project basically the same and have like the same upside, but are half as owned. that just helps you again, like the thing you're talking about. Why is this guy going to be 60% owned when a guy basically right next to him is going to be 20% owned? This tool is going to do a lot of that for you.
And see, this is interesting. Obviously, this is based on the Clash data and stuff. But if you guys watch the Clash on Saturday, obviously, we had rain, crashes, whatever, right? But Larson gets removed from the equation from being optimal because he's moved through the field. Who are those drivers that were at the forefront to lead laps once Kyle Larson was removed? Who are the pivots that my data would have shown to use in the case that Larson fails, which he did? That's Byron, that's Briscoe, who were if I'm not mistaken, the third and fourth highest lap leaders after Larson and Preece. This is specifically how I would, this is specifically how I build lineups before I had this, when I was using, in my head, who are my pivots off of certain drivers or whatever. Like Briscoe, like on this past weekend, he was like, he ended up being like 14% owned, I think. I had 35% of him. And I believe he ended up being optimal. And I think, as I stated, I think he was the third highest lap leader. This is showing you how to use this tool, and how I use it and stuff like that. Or like, I want to learn how to use this more from a teaching perspective. Obviously, it's doing its job here because these are the drivers who were performing well when Larson failed on Sunday. But I need more practice on this to show specifically for like value plays, and stuff. But yet again, that's I'll do that behind the paywall. I'll do that on coaching or whatever. But yet again, I started this stream with, even though we have just the Clash as the first kind of rollout of this stuff, I was extremely satisfied with how my lineups were performing throughout the day. This is showing like that I support this data. I support, like, this is showing what I wanted to do.
We are going to crush this season so hard. I'm so excited. I can't say it enough. I'm excited for this merger because of things like this, right? Getting to expand the offerings into like the really, really cool niche stuff, NASCAR and MMA and PGA and stuff like that. I'm just excited to have everybody here. I'm excited to have Brandon here. I'm excited to have Sheets. I'm excited to have Bobby, and this is why. So here's to us crushing things out.
Yeah, I'm super excited for this. I don't see any other questions in the chat or anything, so I am gonna go ahead and end it here. I will be live Thursday for the duels, probably an hour before the first duel locks, and then obviously Friday night I'll be live an hour before that slate starts. Saturday will probably be a 9 a.m. show, and then Sunday will probably be a 9 a.m. show as well. I typically try and do 9 a.m. shows on Saturday and Sunday for those that want to tune in and watch and everything. For those of you watching between the True DFS channel, the PayDirt channel, the PayDirt on X, thank you guys for being here, and I will talk to you guys later on Thursday. Thanks for watching.